Well, my name is Brendan Roche, and I'm a barrister and a part-time judge called a recorder, doing family work, mostly involving children. So deciding where children live, where there's a dispute between their parents, and being involved in cases where children are removed from their families because they're suffering harm or at risk of suffering harm in the care of their parents. In other words, in care proceedings and adoption proceedings. So I go into court a lot, and I'm dealing with cases where children are injured, abused, and lots of horrible things like that on a regular basis. And today we're joined also by
Christopher. So I'm Christopher Page. I am also a lawyer, but I'm a solicitor rather than a barrister. And I can proudly say that in 38 years, I've only been to court once. So a very different sort of lawyer. I have built up a practice largely looking after families who own and run farms or estates. But perhaps as importantly, I have been very involved in running the law firm where I am as the business. So for up to 10 years now, I've been senior partner, senior leader of that firm. So a large part of my life is spent not being a lawyer, but really running a business which now has over 1,000 people working within it and offices all around the world. So as I say, my life has been split, but actually it's a very happy split in the sense that what I've learned from and with clients I can apply to the business and the other way around.
Do you want to just say, Christopher, how long you've been going to Lourdes and what you've done in Lourdes?
Yes, so I started going to Lourdes, actually the first time I can remember going to Lourdes, I was in a wheelchair because I'd had a very serious illness, which meant that I couldn't walk at the time. So I've seen it from that side. I started going regularly when I was 16 from school, and I was able to go every year, often more than once actually, through to when we were married. We then had 5 children, which was a bit of a distraction. But when they started going to Lourdes, when they were 16, 17, I was then able to return. And most of that time, I have been working primarily in the baths. So my experience of Lourdes is, if you like, narrowed down to the baths, but I do see that as a key part of life in Lourdes. And actually, many of the lessons that I have been lucky enough to learn in the baths, I genuinely have been able to see how that has been applied back in my working life. And you, Brendan?
For me, I think it's about 40 years ago this year that I started going to Lourdes. I went again at the age of 16. Been working as a Brancardier. I stopped when the children were young and returned when the children were older and joined me in Lourdes. And probably one of the main things which has allowed me to go back to Lourdes so often is the fact that I met my wife there, Joanna, when I was 17, she was 17. And we married about 7 years later. We're still together, thank goodness, thank God. And we both work up to now, generally inside the ACOE, providing personal care to our assisted pilgrims, which has been a wonderful experience. Quite by surprise, I was asked to be the chief Brancardier a couple of years ago. And of course, we haven't had a pilgrimage since then. So
All your fault, Brendan.
All my fault. Maybe that was the only way in which God could protect the Catholic Association. So one day, I hope to go back to Lourdes, and one day I will serve as the chief Brancardier, and I'll need lots of help when I do so. So the next stage is really to talk about what influence, what involvement, if any, our faith has on our work. So what are your thoughts on that, Christopher?
Well, I keep thinking about this, and I realized that actually in the early years as a younger lawyer, I don't think I was very clever about seeing the connections between the two. And I think if I was pushed, I don't think actually in any obvious sense my faith, and certainly learned, had any influence on my choice of a career as a lawyer. So I think I can say honestly that it was probably 15 years before I began to really patch the two together and see my job as a vocation, which I think it very much is. And that only ultimately comes not because I'm a lawyer or interested in the technical side of law, but in my relationships with people. And as a solicitor, there's a multiplicity of different relationships, but the key relationships to me are obviously with clients, through clients and directly with the community, and increasingly one's aware of the environment. Obviously, as an employer, one has a close and important relationship with employees. But then in a rather special way within legal practice such as mine, we are owned and run by the partners, so that there is a very interesting and powerful relationship with partners. And I think probably it's as I became a manager, if you like, within the partnership, that the way we have been brought up, the way we believe, the way we approach each other has become has had the most obvious influence on the way that I've tried to shape the way we as partners relate to each other. So the whole business of being one, being part of a greater whole, of everybody having a unique part to play, everybody respecting each other, trusting each other, actually putting all your finances and affect your reputation in the hands of other people. That I've found both easy at one level, because it's the natural way that we as Christians and Catholics approach our communities and the people that we live and work with. But actually it is using, almost instinctively and habitually, using things that we've learned over the years, and coming back to the baths, just seeing that wonderful procession of humanity of all different shapes and sizes, and every one of them equally special and unique, that has been a very, very useful way of approaching partnership, and indeed being an employer in the way we look after our employees. And looking back over time, that I think has been, if you like, the most easy way of seeing how my faith has influenced how I've worked in the office.
I wonder if I could just ask you to be more so concrete, though, because you talk about you have many, many different sorts of relationships at work.
Yeah. And
you're working as a team with your partners and with your employees to one end. But how does your faith concretely touch upon on that?
Well, I think one thing I would say is that it gives one a confidence to say things which other people perhaps don't, and to do things which perhaps other people don't. So, you hear an awful lot about respect for each other and so forth, but actually standing up in front of a group of highly intelligent and independent adults, and in a funny sort of way, trying to get them to think beyond themselves and think about other people. So as I was senior partner, I had huge opportunities to actually address people in a very concrete way, both as partners, but also, for example, I gave the introduction to every induction. So every other month or so, we would have 20, 30, 40 new people in the firm, and I was able to talk to them about what I thought made the firm special, what made behavior between them important. And so, I was teased sometimes as sort of verging on giving sermons, but I think that actually having the confidence of that faith, if you like, and understanding where it came from, was within a commercial context very helpful. Further concrete examples would be actually more for the employees, making sure that they were not just individually treated properly, but that actually all the systems and mechanisms were in place to enable them to develop their careers, to fulfill themselves, to continue their education, to make sure that they had opportunities, that they weren't just being drilled down a particular route because it benefited the partnership, but so that it benefited them and then everyone else. So, that over the last 15 years, the way the firm developed with its in-house learning and what we now have as a business school, and all the sort of training and secondment opportunities, I think all of that is simply a reflection of what we have learned in LERD and otherwise, that everybody really matters, and we have to do everything we can to make sure that each individual finds satisfaction and fulfillment, generally speaking, in working together for each other and obviously for our clients and through them, for the broader society. So those are concrete things, and I think perhaps even more obviously, but I do get a bit worried about this because it can be seen as something on the side of our main job. The whole push towards developing a genuine pro bono, so for that we mean providing legal advice for nothing to people who couldn't otherwise afford it. That's burgeoned over the last few years, notwithstanding the commercial pressures. And I do find that the younger lawyers particularly really want to get engaged in all sorts of different projects, whether it's working in Lesbos with the refugees or working in East London in advice centres and so forth. That really does add something, not just add on something, but it actually integrates into the way they approach their, if you like, their normal client work. So a lot more volunteering. The COVID experience was a great example of how everybody really pulled together and worried about the people around them. And we've set up a foundation now which has justice as its core, where we are backing, partnering other charities with really quite substantial sums of money now. But all of that is, if you like, an add-on to the main job of the lawyers in the firm, people supporting the lawyers, in making sure that the advice we give goes beyond the purely technical legal advice, and that we are aware that the advice we give is to humans, affects humans, that it's highly personalized and broad. So, and I think having all these other structures around gives the lawyers the confidence to do that when they go and approach or are approached by a client, say on an employment issue or a family issue like yourselves, that they actually have the breadth of view and the confidence to give genuine advice rather than just legal advice. And I think that again has just come from this general encouragement towards thinking beyond themselves and thinking into the future. So those are the ways I feel it, and I think that the key challenge is vocabulary. Everybody knows I'm a Catholic. Everybody knows I go to LERD, for example. Everybody knows that I'm involved in other charities. But you have to be jolly careful about the way you talk about these things, particularly within the commercial context. So, we talk about purpose, we talk about being a responsible business, we talk about ESG, and so on. All of those are very helpful ways of coming at a similar, and so that being a consciousness of in everything that you do about the environmental impact, the social justice impact, and all things being governed properly. That's the G. So the way we approach clients, the way we decide whether we're taking clients on or not, the way we look at the way we give advice is to try and take all those factors into account, as well as the regulatory or statutory or contractual legal position.
Has there ever been a major conflict?
Yes.
Between your faith and what you or other people might think were the sort of commercial imperatives, or what pressure?
It happens, Brendan, on a daily basis. So I reassure myself that, well, other than the odd 40 days, Jesus was basically working in the public space, which is what we have to do. And I think that the great challenge for us is, one at the end of the scale, you may have, if you like, the Trappist monk. Then you've got things that we might see in LERD, which are quite obviously good. But then working particularly in the City of London, there are plenty of things which you have to really struggle and use your imagination to see why on earth, or how on earth that could be turned to the good. So the biggest, to me, challenges are that There are clients of the firm who approach us, who get taken on, who when you actually dig deep, you might think, I'm not quite sure that their ethics or their views are aligned to what I've just been talking about. And then the question is, well, do you actually just drop them, or do you try and work with them? Do you try and turn them? Do you try and use them as a means to a better end? So, it's the age-old conundrum between, supporting those that actually have, if you like, some sort of power or have some sort of financial leverage, but trying to use that for the good rather than the bad. So that happens on a daily basis. I think one of the challenges I do really struggle with is hierarchy and ownership and the differentials that you get between partner pay, for example, senior lawyer pay, what's happening in the office, what's happening in the general office, and actually ownership structures generally. I think Catholic social teaching is very good on all of that, and in a way, partnership, because it is a cooperative, can, as I've said earlier, can fit within that. But the trouble is, you get a bit of an apartheid between the lawyers and the non-lawyers, the partners and the non-partners. And so, trying to assess the reward that risk should genuinely receive, as opposed to people being out there just to make money rather than earn money. So that is a difficult thing, particularly, again, working within the city where you're rubbing shoulders with financial institutions, fund managers and so on, who frankly are often just there to make money out of money. So that the whole issue of what does money mean as opposed to what do riches mean, what is real wealth? But again, that's part of the conversation internally and externally. And I think that's a conversation which is, post Thatcher boom, post changes in the city, post 2008. I think it's a conversation which people are more open to, particularly the younger generation. So that's always a challenge. And there are always the temptations of sort of folie de grandeur, if you like. Who are you? I am who I am. I'm no better than anyone else. But the danger that somehow you think, well, I've been successful in worldly terms. I've been successful in commercial terms, however it is. And it's just trying to knock yourself down to, get over yourself, as it were, from time to time. I do find that, and the way the law works, and possibly more so in your side of the profession, the rungs on the ladder are very clear. You become a QC, you become a judge, blah, blah, blah. And this sense of have you succeeded or not, it's very easy to slip into a false assessment of that.
I agree with that. Can I just ask, you referred twice to younger lawyers,
yeah,
wanting to be involved in social justice issues. Now, I suspect a lot of those younger lawyers are not Christians or Catholics.
No.
So therefore, the question is, well, you don't need to be a Catholic or a Christian to understand the importance of teamwork, to understand the importance of looking after people who are less successful, less rich. So what's the point of your faith? What difference does it make?
I'd be very hesitant to say that it's actually very different. I mean, you and I are very similar in terms of our education and family background. Where does culture tip over into, or upbringing tip over into religion, into faith? I think that we have probably been lucky in having experiences and have been taught in a way which possibly accelerates a thought process. And as I said earlier, I do think it gives me a confidence to say things and to talk at different levels. I mean, for example, I'm on record as often saying I love my partners, which is a bit trite in a way, but it's not the sort of phraseology that many senior partners would use, but I do mean it. And I think that, again, you don't need to be a Catholic to say that, but to actually be confident to say it may have been helpful to being a Catholic. But I do think it's a really important point that using vocabulary in different ways, I mean, whether you talk about social justice or Christian ethics, for example, it's a way to a similar end. For me, I guess the ultimate point is that it may be easier because of our upbringing and beliefs to genuinely feel that you can give yourself, and that is the right thing to do, and it's and that sort of unhesitating sense of giving yourself for others and so on. I think again, I would, in the end, I would say it's no better or worse, but it certainly I've had the confidence.
I mean, I have a few thoughts about that. That's one is that it's dangerous to compare.
Yeah.
So undoubtedly, there are some wonderful people who do wonderful things who have no faith, certainly no Christian faith, no Catholic faith, and who are far better people than me.
Yeah.
But probably the better comparison is how I would be without faith and without my religion. And I could probably say, I think, yeah, I could say with some confidence, I would be even worse than I am. So it's undoubtedly true that there are people they're great people who achieve great things without faith. Secondly, I'm reminded of the psalm or song that we sing at the preparation of the gifts on Maundy Thursday, Ubi Caritas, Deus ibi est. You know, where there is love, there is God. In other words, I think that's can be partly taken as a caution against feeling that we all need to fit within the straitjacket of Christianity, of Catholicism. There is one right way of doing it and nothing else. But God doesn't confine himself to parameters laid down by humans. God's rather bigger than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as lawyers, you know, where we are effectively applying rules, and probably more you than me. In other words, you are having to look at the rules as laid down over the years in how people relate to each other, how you protect property and so on. And the glory of the law, is particularly in England, is that we also have this sense of equity. So actually, you can find a way around a lot of the rules to achieve what is the right result. And I think I agree that I guess we were brought up at a time when being a Catholic really was meant to mean something, if you like, better, and it quite clearly isn't. And I think that if we had more training, for example, and I'd like you to develop this, I mean, the sense of conscience. I mean, people talk about Catholic guilt. I've never really felt that myself, but this sense of conscience and the understanding of truth, but also this whole business of discernment. And if I had a big failing, I would say that, and I do have lots, is that I have not felt I've been good at discernment on a daily, weekly, yearly basis. That I've tended to drift through my career in a way which actually, when you look back, I couldn't say, well, I made that decision because I'd sat down one day and I'd really thought it through from my basic Christian Catholic principles and ethics. I've hardly ever done that.
You set me up as if by comparison, I've been extremely good at that, but I haven't. Because one of the things I've sort of told myself in the past I'd like to do, which I've never achieved on a regular basis, is the Jesuit examen. So every day, looking back on the day, seeing where God has been good to you during the day, seeing where you've moved away from God, where you've moved towards God, and then, you know, learning from your experiences of the day, and then setting out objectives in order to sort of move closer to God the following day or the following period of time. I always tell myself I'd like to do that, and normally I'm too tired to do that at the end of the day. But that is a great exercise in discernment, it seems to me. I ended up in family law quite by accident. So again, I think this is a good example of failure to plan. I didn't do family law at university. I when I moved into law, my options were sale of goods and landlord and tenant, I think it was. And I went into a common law set, so fairly broad area of work. But family law was terribly unsexy because it was badly paid in comparison. This is all comparative or relative. But I was doing civil law, and there were some procedural changes which meant that couldn't get into court very much, and I was missing going into court. So I was offered a family case, and I loved it, and I was quite good at it because I enjoyed it. And my family practice snowballed until it's now almost exclusively what I do. And it's because I'm just moving to more specifics about what I do. It's because I'm dealing with very raw human experiences. And I'm accompanying people going through really difficult times. If I'm acting for a parent whose child has suffered serious injuries, then, and they may have been responsible, or their partner may have been responsible, or often it's not clear who was responsible. I don't know. They say they didn't cause the injuries, and there's a whole trial process to decide, are they responsible for causing them? And these are really tough times, and you're often dealing with people who have had very difficult childhoods and backgrounds. They may have been the victims of abuse themselves. And I find that it's very rewarding to accompany people, to show empathy, not necessarily letting them off if they have caused injury to their child, but trying to understand how they could have reached that position where they lost control, for instance, shook their baby, causing brain injuries, and trying to help them see why they did that, or how they could talk to people who could then help them understand what led them to that situation and whether it could be avoided again in the future. In other words, if someone, for instance, to be trite, if someone had an anger management problem, how could they overcome that? If they have, I often act for parents who have had really difficult childhoods and have grown up with this sort of pain, which they meet, they sort of assuage, if that's a too grand a word, their pain by drink, by drugs, by entering very quickly unsuitable relationships. And they need to work on that, to sort of unpick that, to do therapy, say, to recognize what is driving them into risky situations. And I find that fascinating. I don't always have a very positive effect. Sometimes it can be really disappointing. You try and save someone. I had a client recently who had lost several children to adoption, and I fought very hard to win her the time to address her own issues, and ultimately it all failed. So it can be very difficult.
Yeah.
So maybe just speaking very briefly about how faith helps me. I very much believe that my faith is the rock which I can rely on in order then to undergo all the stress of being in court, all the pressures of representing people who have put themselves in very difficult positions or found themselves in very difficult positions. Having that bedrock means I can juggle all the different pressures in my life, running several cases at the same time, having to react to some very difficult evidence at the last minute. Life can be very difficult, very stressful. I'm sure. I'm not suggesting it's more or less stressful than yours. I think you have an incredibly stressful job. But having that faith, which I exercise by going to church each week, by going to Lourdes, by other experiences, which I sort of nourish by doing that sort of thing. It helps me cope, I think.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, again, to pick up on a theme which you said earlier, you said you talked about the dangers of becoming too self-important. particularly if you're successful in a worldly sense. And I find that going to church, hearing the readings, which often or nearly always are about serving other people, not being concerned about your own success, that's a really healthy message to hear. And you can't, it's not a case of hearing it once and that's enough, because, well, I forget. You get distracted.
I agree. I think the repetition, I mean, in the Psalms, when you pick up on themes, don't you? But the theme of justice in the Psalms is pumped through the whole time, and it brings you down to earth. And I entirely agree about that. And I think also, for example, working in the baths in Lourdes, where you're pretty well stripped off, you know, no one knows who you are. Most of them aren't English, so they can't even pick up from the way you speak or the way you dress. Everybody puts on the uniform of the blue pinafore, as it were, and it's the most wonderful leveler and a very humbling thing to do. And actually, it's that sort of repetition, but also that refreshment makes the liturgy, makes going to church, makes being part of the parish community absolutely vital. And so, you know, when people say, well, what's the point of going to church? That to me is the point of going to church. I mean, the whole sort of Eucharistic aspect of it is terribly important to me as well, as I really felt that during COVID, really miss going to communion. But it did actually force me to really think about the other forms of communion, i.e. with the firm, even if it was virtually, with clients, with friends from Lourdes, you know, the people that we're in touch with that sadly we haven't seen for a couple of years, whether they're from the CA or beyond. And I think I entirely agree that the need to keep tapping back into that source is vital. I think also, though, Brendan, I agree with you about the coping bit. It enables one to cope, but I think actually it also enables one to hope. I mean, we both see really difficult situations, and yours may be more on the sort of family side. I can get deeply depressed about the way some people behave within the city, other end of the scale in a sense. But I do feel this optimism. You know, I think optimistic leadership, if there's a characteristic of a Christian or Catholic leader, it should be optimism and joy. Yeah. And I think that too often that gets lost. And having a joyful, bouncy lawyer is actually quite unusual. You know, we have a reputation of being rather dour and grey and a little bit dusty. So
yeah, yes, I think it gives me the energy to not to give up and to try and convey that to my clients, saying, you know, no matter what's happened in the past, look to the future. Things can change. You can change. Now, I don't try and convert people when I do that. I think I'd be sacked if I did. But those underlying values, that underlying optimism, it's really important to think. I think, in fact, there are a lot of family lawyers who are Christians, who have that underlying sense of optimism about humanity, which keeps them going despite the awful things, you know, which we deal with. You know, we deal with dead children, you know, and all things which people are horrified by, and all sorts of abuse. It really is horrific. But people keep going because they understand how all of us, first of all, to introduce a pessimistic aspect, all of us are capable of great wickedness, but all of us are capable of great good. So, yeah, I think that my faith certainly helps me. I wonder if, unless it's anything more you want to say, I wonder if you might just say a little bit more about what going back to Lourdes will mean, why you keep going back to Lourdes, and why you would encourage, whether you would encourage people to go to Lourdes to obtain what you've obtained there.
Well, I think it's really just continuing that theme that going to Lourdes is a massive injection of hope, of optimism, of joy, of normality, of humanity. You know, all these really essential aspects of life, which, however we approach it, we need help with it. We need help from others. And it may be that Lourdes is a bit of a shortcut to finding that, and that actually we could equally tap into those sorts of sources more locally. But having got into the habit, as you say, I mean, I think my first visit to Lourdes was 1960, sitting on my father's shoulders. So that, you know, it's a habit it's hard to throw off, and getting to Lourdes is like going home. It's something which we've all been struggling with, trying to bring it back to the UK, if you like, back to the other 51 weeks of the year, back to normal life. And I always talk about the challenge of moving Sunday to Monday, or moving Lourdes from Lourdes. But and there's no doubt that is something we must continue to work at. But being able to actually go to Lourdes, go to the baths, go to the Kai, all of that will mean a huge amount to me. And you know, it's often hard to express that to people that haven't been there. But whilst I wouldn't try to convert people to Catholicism, I would always try and encourage them to come to Lourdes or do something similar, because I think it's been a very vital part of my life.
You don't need to be a Catholic to go to Lourdes, do you? We know many people who are at different stages of their journey, as it were, and who have no particular enthusiasm for established religion, but who love going to Lourdes.
Yeah.
And it's not, is it? It's not simply the place. It's going there with many others on pilgrimage, and it's that sense of being in a family. It's a very intense experience, and seems to me, you know, the week with the Catholic Association in Lourdes, it's wonderful because you're meeting people from all different walks of life. You're working together. You are witnessing other people's faith. I found that very nourishing, and I've been pretty bland in my faith and my practice of my faith. Seeing the deep spirituality, the deep faith on other people's faces, you know, has been a really great lesson. I mean, I always remember, and I've got to be careful now because I tear up every time I think about this. I always remember taking a man, this is a long time ago, in about sort of late 80s, I think, to the baths, who had been an assisted pilgrim in the UK with us. And in his suitcase, there was an application to join the seminary, but he was never going to join the seminary because he was close to death. He was a young man, probably in his 30s. And he was on a stretcher, and I pushed his stretcher to the baths. So this one time in the week he was going to have a bath. And when we left the Accueil, which is it's a sort of place where people who need medical care stay. When we left, I asked him whether he wanted to say the rosary, and we had time for 1 decade. And he asked that we say the way of the cross. And it seemed, I'm starting to tear up now. It seemed that, you know, that was where he was on his journey. And it made such a difference just seeing that faith on someone's face.
Yeah.
You know, he was on a stretcher, close to death, and the idea of going to have a cold bath at that point, well, I'm not sure I would do it.
No.
But to see him, it was so inspiring.
Yeah, you get inspired on a daily basis there, don't you? I have similar, looking after, he was probably only 14, a boy who probably only had 6 months left. And he was trying to sit up on his stretcher, and he just kept asking me, what's wrong with him? What's wrong with her? And every time I told him, he would say, oh, for them.
Oh, yeah.
And yet he was, in medical terms, in a far worse position than anyone.
that sort of rich experience is multiplied over the days that we spend in Lourdes, and I think that experience it filters out into the rest of our lives, I think.
Yeah, yeah, it does. As I've used this phrase before, it irrigates the rest of my life.
Yeah, so that's why it's worth having a go, having a look, coming to Lourdes, no matter where you are in your journey, because it is a wonderful experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, should we call it a day there?
I think that's probably